8 as we look at the subject this morning. We know you. Coming from a verse, it's literally coming out of chapter, what is it, verse 2 of chapter 8. It says, to me they cry, my God, we, Israel, we know you. Understanding that in the short lesson. Let me just start this off. If you clicked on the short lessons, this is going to be one of those relatively redundant sermons because I'm pretty much just going to follow the pattern I used in talking about this in chapter 8. If you didn't, then you did well because, yeah, it'll sound a little bit more brand new. But the bottom line is the structure in this chapter was such that I wanted to slow down and go a little bit more thoroughly through some of the things in this chapter that, for whatever reason, helped create a familiar theme that we're seeing now. There's a separation between God and his people. And as opposed to us just going back to the same old way Jeremiah talked about it, or Ezekiel talked about it, or Isaiah talked about it, this one way is going to be what I call a red flag passage, where if you got checklists in your life of stuff you got to get done, you try to just work on your memory from time to time, and you realize, I can work on my memory sometimes, but there's some things I just need to put on the checklist, otherwise I might forget some important things that there are to do. This is a checklist passage that works a lot like 1 John, a book that over and over again uses the phrase, by this you know, as a New Testament Christian, that you are walking on a healthy path. The reason why this passage is so important is because one of the first things that they're talking about connects with something that we have in our culture today, which talks about self-awareness. And it's a term that we use that connects back to exactly what's going on here. They believe they're in one place, but they've left the checklist out for what it really means to be a people of God, and so they've strayed without knowing it. Telling God they know you, what he's going to say is, are you sure? And understanding that, it's important to understand that the book of Hosea is a marked departure from some of the things we've gotten to see this year. We've gotten to see people like Sam and Sean pick exceptional brides. And God willing, they won't be the only ones. There will be more people who get a chance to pick an exceptional bride. Hosea didn't get that choice. He had a choice of a bride, but he had it from a very narrow set of or segment of society. What we talked about before made the man of God an illustration of some of the things that are about to happen to the people of God. So Hosea wasn't blessed with the kinds of choices our folks have been blessed with recently, and God willing will continue to be blessed with going forward. He, in this chapter, had to live out a life that was a living example of a people who said they knew God, but God was like, are you sure? As we begin in verses 1 and 2. Verse 1 of chapter 8. Set the trumpet to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. And we already said he's going to be like, are you sure? Ultimately, he's going to take the form of, I didn't say the couple, but I got to see one of my favorite basketball players on TV with his wife playing one of those dating game type shows where they test how much do you really know about your spouse. And I could almost see the tension. This guy was used to making, shots on the big stage, used to winning championships under the lights. The pressure is nervous, answering questions about his wife because he knows if some of these questions don't get answered right, the drive home might be a little bit tougher than facing the crowd in Sacramento or New York. You get it. And that's essentially the structure that the rest of this chapter is going to focus on. He's going back to some times where God is like, oh, you know me, do you? Some of the questions he's going to ask them are going to expose a little different side of that thing. We talked about that before, so we're going to move on. Verse 3 is going to say, Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. Verse 4, they made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. Let me pause there. Because ultimately one of the things that they're going to do in setting up the kings and the princes that he's talking about is it's going to have a foundation. And before the kings and the princes came, there was this mythology that grew up, and it reminded me of times in my life where I've been a fly on the wall in conversations where they've gone on in an area of expertise that I've got. And I just kind of sit there as they're talking, and they know I'm there, and they know I've done that thing, and it's just kind of like the question never comes up. Is that consistent with your experience in doing this thing? And it makes me remember in times where I've gone to the doctor and I've had a chance to become, anybody ever become a Google doctor? Me too. Where I'm going to the doctor armed with all my Google information. And I got my theory of what's going on and what might fix it. And forgot I never went to medical school. God willing, my Google PhD or whatever see, I don't even know that much, doctor's degree gives way to actually asking the doctor some questions that might actually get us a legitimate answer. We got folks who deal with money. I try to qualify it all the time. I'm starting to make all these financial illustrations. Like, go check that out with the experts, the people who know. Because once again, I got my YouTube answers. But I didn't go to business school. I said it's Southern, business school. I didn't go, right? And so I've been through colleges and whatnot. We got folks who actually taught in higher education. Well, sister, I had a chance to talk to her last night. Just turned her papers in. So she write her grades in so she can enjoy her time. Now, I've been through school. I don't know what it's like to teach at the college level. And so it'd be wise for me to listen to some of those folks. But that's what happens when, God willing, we're in a place where we actually want to find out what's going on. It's nothing wrong with having theories about life. It's nothing wrong with having science. One thing I do know about science, correct me if I'm wrong again, is you got these things called hypotheses. And a hypothesis is something you actually take into the lab and test. Otherwise, it ain't science, it's just guessing. And the problem is they're starting to move forward through life with their guesses, untested. Nothing but a hypotheses. And over time, what's happening is their hypotheses to them are becoming theories. But here's the thing, a theory still ain't a fact, it's the theory. It's one of the reasons why we argue so much with non-believers about the whole concept of evolution. I don't think it's ever been promoted past the theory of, thank you, I'm sorry. And so that's why it has to be tested. But we cannot blame folks who take that approach to life because we do it too. We talked about it in the young adults class not too long ago, right? This whole concept of we slip into times as God's people. That's who these are. Every time I'm saying God's people, I'm typically using God's people in place of Israel so that we don't lose the application. Because we do the same thing. We take our untested hypotheses about life and we go for it. And now what's he saying? What are they doing? That's what happened. Verse 4. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With silver and gold they made the idols. And that is the thing that this time made it a fresh perspective on idolatry. Because what they're doing, like we said, the block of wood or whatever, it's nothing. Here, he's at least giving them credit to using gold and silver this time, right? But if you go back to Isaiah 44, let's go back to Isaiah 44 real quick. Isaiah 44, I think I use that one. Around about verse 18. Hosea to me, I said in one of the short lessons, I was having a lot of trouble organizing Hosea because it looked like this whole Proverbs thing all over again. Where I was getting almost a whole sermon every 2 or 3 verses, but I couldn't really connect the dots with them. And so that's kind of how I structured the study guide this week. It started out random, but then I started realizing, oh, wait, there is a cohesion there. I don't know if it's going to preach that way, but that's what's happening in Hosea. And it's a lot like these discussions in Isaiah, where he's spending almost a whole chapter talking about the folly of idolatry. Hosea takes just a couple of verses to get through the same point, as we will look in verses 18 through roughly 20 of Isaiah 44. They know not, nor do they discern, for he has shut their eyes so that they cannot see, and their hearts so that they cannot understand. No one considers, nor is there knowledge or discernment to say, half of it I burned in the fire. I also baked bread on its coals. I roasted meat and have eaten. And shall I make the rest of it an abomination? Shall I fall down before a block of wood? He feeds on ashes. A deluded heart has led him astray, and he cannot deliver himself or say, is there not a lie in my right hand? And that goes back to our checklist in Hosea. He is giving them a checklist because the idolatry, it's one thing, but it's nothing without the lie. It's nothing without the mythology. And we've said before, the mythology basically gives me permission to make up whatever hypothesis I want about life and go live it that way, whether it's true or not. And look at what they're missing out on. He's saying, it took me for years to understand. I don't know if I understand it now. But to me, the first few times I read through this, I was like, well, I could see a block of wood a whole lot better than I could see God. And, right? If I'm the only one that thought it, just let me use my tone. You think it more humbly. But I think, I thought that from time to time. Because that exposes what's really going on with me. See, I struggle in times when I'm asked to believe in something I can't see. Right? And so what they're missing out on is something that an older, wiser preacher helped me understand when he was talking about this time of year, the crucifixion and the cross. Not the birth, but the end of the story. When he said they dragged him up on that cross, cut from wood, that he spoke into existence. They hung him on his own stuff. And understand how that points back to these passages where he's talking about idolatry. They don't necessarily even have the decency to pick the best piece of wood in the forest to worship. They're just cutting something sturdy they can build something out of. Understand if it's going to be logical, at least at least go worship the most impressive tree. A couple weeks ago, I was on one of my YouTube rants. Might have been that same one I talked about Wednesday night, right? Renee's like, I know he's nutty, but this is even worse today. I'm laughing at the computer. I think one of the times I calmed down, I was watching, it's a pretty impressive tree. They're talking about like biggest trees on earth. I was like, whoa. And it clicked with me. This week, that's not what they're worshiping. Nobody's going to let them cut that down and make an idol. They're taking something less than that and bowing down to it. And God's saying that's literally what you're locked into. You think it's wrong or you think it odd to worship me because you can't see me? The thing that you're choosing is even less than the God who, just take a second and think. Even if you don't believe in God, something made all this work together. I'm not going to go off on the atheist Christian thing, but some of the greatest minds on earth, if they think it through, they realize Einstein was not an atheist. I remember Richard Dawkins when he realized that out of all the Christians he had debated, somebody brought that up to him and he was shocked when he realized Einstein was not an atheist. He was not a Torah-observant Jew, but he was a Jewish man who said things like, we are like small children walking into a great big old library. We don't know how it's organized, but we do in the sciences know it's organized in a way that's beyond our understanding. And so what God is helping us understand in his conversations about idolatry is you don't have to know how it works, but just go to the scientists to understand that there is an organization that they acknowledge. Otherwise, how is it that you go about having the structure for the sciences to build on and to test their hypotheses and make them into theories that over time can actually become facts? Bottom line is, I want to cry too. When is he going to shut up? Bottom line is, in all that idolatry, understand what they are picking, and it's what we often do. It's one of the reasons why I talk about our emotional needs. It's so important to be careful of understanding your own emotional needs because the enemy is typically going to offer you options that meet an emotional need you have so that you're so fixated on filling that need that you lose out or lose track on all the flaws in the complete picture. And that's what idolatry gave them permission to do. See, when I'm in those situations where I am going into the doctor's office with my Google diagnosis, sometimes I can have fixed in my mind the thing about what's going on with me that concerns me most. And all my research can fixate on where my anxieties are when my anxieties aren't the reality of my science. I forgot we got a nurse back here. That's right. It's my fault, right? And so I'm fixated on what I'm worried about. That needs counseling. My medical issue needs a doctor. And all my research is going to where I'm worried, I'm anxious, and sometimes I'm just scared. And it's preventing me from seeing the truth. And that's where they are right now, see? They don't know God because there's some emotional void that the enemy is feeding them a whole lot of answers on, and he's making it super interesting to the point where they're ignoring the larger reality that they really need help with. God's not trying to compete with the block of wood, but he's saying, think about it. It's quite possible that if you just pay attention to what you're doing, you realize that you're putting your hopes of alleviating all that anxiety, of being happier, of fill in the blank. You're putting it in a block of wood. And maybe think just for a second, maybe there is something larger. Maybe there is something that actually spoke that wood into existence. within a system that David says, not to be rude, but I think the Psalm says, the fool says in his heart there is no God, right? And so there's nothing wrong with questioning, but at a certain point, one of the dangers in finding loopholes is, like I told you, when I had to move past my law mind and into, seeing things from a larger perspective, is we were encouraged and paid a lot of money to find loopholes and stuff and to shoot stuff down and find everything that was wrong with the thing. But when you get in the habit of finding loopholes, that's a very narrow picture of reality. And so if all you're ever doing is shooting holes in something, one of the things you wake up to in life is you realize that the Bible says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And so what I'm doing is, unless you all have found another system for us learning from one another, iron sharpens iron. He set up in his body elders and prophets and teachers and evangelists. What it allows me to do is shoot holes in anything I don't want to hear while taking a pass on some very real truths that God may be offering me, because I'm always going to be able to find a loophole. I'm always going to be able to find an imperfection. I'm always going to be able to find a reason why I shouldn't listen or why I should go somewhere else. And that's what's happening with the idols. They found a reason to shoot down God, right? Can't really shoot him down. But like I said, I can't fault them. My own problem with God half the time, I can't see you. I need something else. That's always going to be an excuse for me to look at this as a book of suggestions. And that seems to be the basis for the idols they have created. Understanding that. I'm just going to go on to verse 5 and say, I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For it is from Israel. A craftsman made it. It is not God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken into pieces. One of the reasons why it's so important for them to break the emotional connection they have to idolatry is it relates to a question one of the brothers asked today about traditions. He asked about traditions. And as we were going through the organization of the Bible and we got to the Gospels, we said the traditions were basically the point at which Jesus ended up doing a lot of fighting with the establishment of that day. And if you spent very much time studying the Gospels and the life of Christ, you'll see it was over, okay, which traditions actually control. We come from a movement that basically is called the Restoration Movement. What we were trying to do was find, well, what were the traditions that we should actually care about? It's not getting rid of all tradition. It's finding what was the actual tradition that God established. And really, that's the story of the gospel. And so when God is telling them to, when he's talking about this whole concept of myths versus the reality of God, one of the things that goes back to chapter 6, one of the previous chapters, if you go back with me to verse 3 of chapter 6, it's going to say, let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. But God's response in verse 4 is, what shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like the morning cloud, like the dew that goes away early. He's talking about the fact that it's temporary. It's going to be super similar to something we see in chapter 7, verse 14, where he says, they do not cry to me from the heart, but they wail upon their beds for grain and wine. They gash themselves as they rebel against me. Although I train them and strengthen their arms, they devise evil against me. One of the things that he is talking about that reminded me so much of the life of Jesus is the way in which, just give me one second. In the Gospel of John, Jesus talked about the way in which the truth would set them free. And the wisdom in what God does back in chapter 6 seems to be this. It goes to something that we talked about, that whole concept of a counseling term called hoovering. When I want a relationship to be restored, sometimes my emotional need will overwhelm my logic. And if you're in a situation where you have been harmed before, a lot of times that term hoovering refers literally to the vacuum cleaner. And just as a vacuum cleaner will clean your floor by sucking in dirt, there are pitfalls in our relationships that try to draw us back in without real repentance. And so what is happening is over time you will realize that there are times when people will give you an apology. They will give you something in exchange for something that's much more substantial than what they're offering. We talked about it before. It's trying to exchange courtesies for trust. And those are two different things. God catches on to that here. And he says, even though they are professing their love for me, it's like the morning dew that shows up one minute, but it's quickly gone. He's like, I'm not going to exchange the love of God, the sacrifice of my son that we celebrate this time of year, for simple platitudes. And understand how that relates to us as people. Because by the time he gets to John, there are times when the condition of getting back into a relationship is accepting the same old pretense that we were working under before. God tells you in John chapter 8, famous passage, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. What God is helping us understand in this chapter and back in chapter 6 is don't accept what they used to call any wooden nickels. Any nickels that look like money but they aren't going to spend. Don't accept a half-hearted apology that basically invites you back in to the same old unhealthy relationship. And what he is basically helping them to understand is that any situation where you got to walk back into that relationship, you accept the courtesies, but you're still walking on eggshells. There's still certain things you can't talk about that are flat out true. That's not healing. And God's saying, I'm not willing to accept that. He's like, the truth is what will set you free. And you have to realize what's really behind that is an invitation back into bondage. It's not a person who is looking at you as a person who worships God and saying, I worship the same God as you. You have a right to be fully free as God has called you to be. It's not like me asking to go back to my party days back in college. I do whatever I want after. We won this week. Better take advantage of it. We might lose next week. Right? It's not me asking to go back to that. It's me asking for relationships where people are encouraging me to live in the fullness of the truth that God has called me to live in. Why? Because it's not just telling the truth. It's not just sounding smart. It's not just sounding right. My emotional freedom is staked and rooted in me being able to have an honest conversation with you. And understand, anytime you're being drawn back in a relationship where you can't speak the healing truth, you got to ask yourself, what am I being drawn back into? And that's what God is giving us an example of here in chapter 6 and once again in chapter 8. As much as like I said, I look for the happy passages every week. I look for that new covenant passage. I found one that said, I'm going to make you like our brother was talking about. It's a new, I know, sweetie, it's a new covenant. Be happy. That's okay. But God is saying there's a real relationship that goes along with that new covenant. And I'm not willing to settle for anything. God, we can't hurt God. I've said it over and over again. But we can hurt his kids with the same old habits that are simply covered over. You remember we talked about when he was making the rebukes back in Ezekiel. He's like, the prophets, priests, don't paint over the toxicity that's still going on. Because God does care about the way we treat one another, even though we can't get to him. I'm yelling. I'm sorry. Verse 7. For they shall sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads. It shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it. Famous passage. Study God leaves it open-ended. You tell me how you think that passage fits in the larger context of this chapter. It's famous. I don't have to preach everything. I connected it in this short lesson. We've heard this before. It's a with the measure you use passage. But it's that one that I don't usually quote. I haven't quoted to this point. The measure we use doesn't control how much God pours back to us. It's just the proportion, right? I've said it different in the thing, but you get it. It doesn't control when God stops pouring. And so when he says, you've sown the wind, but you'll reap the whirlwind, I pulled up some pictures of whirlwinds, tornadoes and whatnot, hurricanes much. He's talking about understand that in life, and it goes back really, it's one of the reasons why the brother mentioned the law this morning in the young adults class. It's so important to understand the law, and the law of simple things like property theft. You don't get to just take someone's otherwise peaceful life. Yo, I don't get to just come into your house, you ain't bothered me, done nothing, take some stuff, maybe break some stuff, and then go out and just be, I'm sorry, y'all, here's your stuff back. No. the law says not only do you have to pay for what you did, what you stole and what you broke, but there you have to pay multiples. Because these people didn't bother you. They didn't do anything to you. You disturbed their peace. And so how do you put a number on the pain and suffering and what it feels like now that you've been violated, right? Your security system's been broken down. You're going to wonder whether or not somebody's going to do it again. You going to keep the same security system? No, you're probably going to spend a little bit more money on security next time. Who do you think should be responsible for that? Now we're starting to see how God tolls consequences. It's not just property stuff. It's the way he measures the damage we do to one another in our personal lives. We lose track. Because a lot of times, how many times you see people like in the news? They really, oh, I'm so sorry I broke in this time of year. It's the holidays. No. You got to catch them. You got to convict them. You got to get them to stop lying and saying they didn't do it. And then you got to get the restitution. The court's not even going to tell you, thank you. Y'all missed that conversation. It was real quick. You're not going to waste the court's time, the court's money, their time, and their money, and just pay for what you know. It's multiples. You sow the wind, you do the stealing, you don't know when the punishment stops. Just ask the folks who are in prison on these long bids. It seemed cool to impress the fellas on whatever day we broke into whatever or did whatever thing, but 15 years later, you're still locked down, and yeah, you sold the wind. It took a day to commit the crime. 15 years later, you're still paying for it. That's law. And God is saying you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. That's biblical law too, as we continue to go on. Verses 8 through 10. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey, wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and the princess shall soon writhe because of the tribute. Understand in verse 8, that whole concept of a useless vessel is really going to connect to some things that we see in Jesus' ministry. It's really a frightening parallel, where there's a story of a fig tree. One time it's an actual fig tree that God or Jesus comes into contact with his apostles. Another time he uses the illustration of somebody who had a fig tree planted on his land, but it was not yielding fruit. And he was like, let's just get rid of it. But there was an intercessor that sounds a whole lot like the Christ who says, sir, let's just dig around it and see if it will produce. And then if it hasn't produced in a certain amount of time, then you can go ahead and get rid of it, which connects to something else that we're going to see in the book of Jude when he talks about this concept of waterless clouds, or I forgot the other illustration, but it's super similar to what we have here in terms of a useless vessel. Understand that there are times in my life, especially when I went overseas. This is a different version. Seems like I'm telling them overseas stories every week now. But one of the things I was hoping for is I was getting to go back to a place. Y'all know the history of slavery. My people weren't born in America. And so there were some things that, ironically enough, when I got a chance to go back to Africa, they were just a fit. I was shocked at how similar my life in southern America was to the way things still function in some parts of the continent. And one of those things that once you start getting your hopes up, you're going to start finding more and more answers about what life really does. You want things to make sense. Sometimes you get your expectations too high. And one of the things I started to expect was all this wisdom I was going to get from the elders. Not elders like we've got here, but just in society. Those who at a certain point, the Bible literally says, the older women should be able to, right, counsel the younger. And likewise, there's just a certain expectation, a desire you have, whether it's just that daddy thing or not. You want to be able to have somebody you can look up to. And this concept is going forward to what Jude is going to talk about. Look, that fig tree thing, when Jesus curses the fig tree, I had trouble with that for years. Because it's literally going to say figs weren't in season. But it goes back to that thing we talk about so often, and it's the difference between personality and character. I don't think Jesus was saying, I'm demanding that you produce figs out of season. But the thing that it talks about in that parable is the fact that the tree was in leaf. And I ran across somebody one time who said, look, if the tree is in leaf, that should go along with production. And so it's not a sin not to produce figs. It is a sin to put out the appearance that you got figs when you got none. And that's the waterless cloud thing. It is, think about it like this. What are we going, I think a sign, I don't know. What are we going through right now? We ain't got no serious lacks, but on the mission fields, one of the things we would have was, you don't often have depending upon where you go, it might be 30 minutes between a restroom. Not every place has a public restroom. That's one of the things you gotta take for granted when you're leaving the house. And so sometimes you wonder why, the whole habit we used to have maybe back in the day, you just find you a tree, find you some shrubbery. That's a thing over there, right? And so could you imagine if every so often you got restroom posted, but it's just a facade. You're ready to go. You got your hopes up. You really need to go, but there's nothing there. I'll give you another one. They had this seafood restaurant in town. King Prawns, they advertised. I went in and I sat down. I was like, I'll have an order of prawns, please. They're like, oh, that's just the side. We don't serve prawns anymore. Now, that's a true story, right? And so I'm in a landlocked place where there's no seafood. I'm shocked. But that's what happens at times when parts of what Hosea is talking about, is there are times when, or really going back to Daniel, where deception has become such a rigid thing that people don't even expect that they really have to tell the truth anymore. And so now they're beginning to advertise themselves as something they're completely not. Okay, now I got a better example. I'm always on YouTube. Clickbait much? Okay, now you know. People are becoming bolder and bolder advertising content that has nothing to do with the actual content. And maybe y'all don't find that frustrating. I don't throw a whole lot of thumbs down because I post stuff and I don't want thumbs down on my stuff. But you clickbait me and you're pretty likely you're going to get a thumbs down on your content. Because I get sick of it. Or having to wait 15 minutes into a video to get to the point. That's why I was trying to make them in 5 minutes or so. It ain't working so good, but I try to get it at least started. Let you know where we're going, right? Because I get sick of waiting 10 minutes just to, what were we talking about? The number of times I got to go back to the title just to remember why I clicked on the video. Thank you. Y'all feel me now? All right, forget all the other illustrations. Clickbait, you got it. And so that's what this waterless cloud is. When we saying they're a useless vessel, it'd be one thing to just be nothing, for me to see nothing in the middle of the floor. But it's another thing for me to see a vessel, pick it up, pour some water in it, and it just start running all over the floor. It's one thing for me not to have the expectation. God doesn't punish you for me having faulty expectations of you and what he has created you to be, to the degree you're fulfilling those expectations. But to the degree I am out there setting clickbait traps for my content, he is going to hold me accountable for that. Because he's saying, just like this man wanted to go overseas and find those elders who were going to be the mentors that I was hoping I was going to be able to find. That was a disappointment in that culture, in that situation. And understand how it's one thing for me to just point the finger, but it's another thing to realize, wait a minute, if you're missing that thing, why don't you just try to be that for somebody else? Because you know what it's like to hope for wisdom in a certain place, and then your bucket just start leaking, right? We'll tell more stories, but it's a long, we got about a year of Bible left. I don't know, anyway, God is good. But that's a horrible disappointment. And so my prayer for you is my prayer for me that we not be that disappointment. That if we don't do anything else coming out of this sermon, we pray for God to actually make us the real thing. Make us the potential that he has given us to be. Make us the thing that he has actually advertised us to be. So that be one less location where people can expect to be disappointed in this culture that is so often so disappointing now. Please make us end, or make the disappointment end with us. May we be the thing that he has actually promised us to be. Verses 11 through the rest of the chapter. Yeah, I can skip verse 10. Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning. They have become altars for sinning. Were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat on it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt, for Israel has forgotten his maker and has built places. And Judah has multiplied built palaces. And Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send a fire upon its cities and shall devour her strongholds. Understanding the concept in verse 13 of remembrance. I'm not sure whether it's better to end there. Let's back up to verse 12. He's going to say, were I to write him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. That goes back in a lot of ways to where we started the chapter. The danger, the functional danger, beyond, oh, we just don't know things about my spouse anymore, is when you're looking at that whole concept and when people are putting you on the spot to learn things about or expose what you know or don't know about your spouse. Nobody's going to know everything about their spouse, right? So maybe show a little mercy, right? I'm just guessing from old youth minister perspective. The fact that I don't know everything about you will hopefully have me in a mindset to have some mercy on you about the things you don't know about me. But it's not so much the knowledge as it is the heart. If I realize that questions like that expose some things that I don't know about you, maybe it just puts me in a mindset that I really want to, if I'm never going to know everything, God willing, I'm committed to just do better. Because what we had at the very beginning of this chapter is a group of God's people who their primary trap was, they thought they already knew enough. And that's the thing that we are cautioned against, because from time to time we say, everyone who exalts themselves will be humbled, but everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. God doesn't want us to be know-it-alls in our relationships. He just wants the absence of knowledge to drive us to actually show how much we love the people around us, whether it's a spouse, it's a friend, whatever, by getting to know the things that just make their life, God willing, at least a little bit easier. If not a whole lot. It's not thinking that I've reached the point in my relationship where I know enough about you that I can set it on cruise control. And so likewise, if we understand how that can help our marriages, we're described as the bride of, yeah, you're right. I heard that one before. I know. But please don't lose the impact of how it can affect my practical life with you and how my life with you and your life with your spouses and your friends is a living illustration of, okay, you get that point too. It's a living illustration that God has given us for how we can practically, daily, improve our walk with him. So we do not end up where I skipped over in verse 13. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. Got to reconcile that with, as far as the east is from the west, he has promised to forget our sins. This goes back to an old point you've heard before. If we let him. It's one of the reasons why we talked about 1 John being one of those by this passages. He says, by this you will know that you are actually the children of God. I'm going to reword that. If you let him forget the wrong things or the things that he was upset about in the first place, right? I say it all the time. But why does that matter? Because if you go back to chapter 7, the part I didn't read. God willing, I'll end up there. Beginning around verse 1, and then we're going to skip to verse 13. When I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim is revealed, and the evil deeds of Samaria, for they deal falsely. The thief breaks in, and the bandits raid outside, but they do not consider that I remember all their evil. Now their deeds surround them, and they are before my face. Understand, this is just going to be Marcus's opinion on the passage, but I don't think that now I remember all their evil deeds is unbroken or disconnected from the second half of the passage that says their deeds surround them. We talked about it in the short lesson. It'd be one thing if it's not the short lesson, talked about it in the young adults class this morning. It's one thing if somebody commits a relatively minor offense. 10 years on, I'm still on that. It's not really harming me. I'm not still, as we talked about, trying to overcome the consequences of an injury that was caused to me by a crime or a sin or something like that. But I'm just clutching it. That's on me. But it's one thing if that one thing I did 10 years ago has been refreshed daily, weekly, yearly maybe. That's going to create a pile. And that's what God is describing here. Their deeds surround them. They are before his face. And he's basically helping to paint a picture for us that in order to forget the things that he wants to forgive, once again it goes back to that whole truth concept. He would functionally have to walk around in denial to be able to forget, because there it is all over again. And that's the condition that they are in Israel. And what happens over time is, as we've said it before, if I haven't used this illustration, Mom was coming to pick me up. Or no, she was coming to visit me for graduations, one of the graduations, right? I was in Minnesota, and I was driving around, and I was videotaping. I mean, it's a big event. I might want to memorialize it. Y'all know me. I don't take a whole lot of pictures of me and stuff. I don't memorialize that kind of stuff. But this time I did. And I think it had a larger purpose than just memorializing the moment. Because I didn't realize, I was wondering why Mama was sitting there. Why is Mama so quiet? She's not saying anything. I'm having fun. Maybe there's something wrong with Mama. And then I got a chance to listen to the tape back. This is back when we had videotapes. So I listened back to it on videotape, VHS. And I listened to the music I had, bumping in the car while Mom was trying to ride around Minneapolis, seeing the sights with me. And I had made this special tape of all the clean music I was going to play because I knew Mama was going to be in the car. And I knew she wouldn't want to listen to everything I was listening to. But I had been listening to certain beats for so long that what seemed clean to me had Mama just, whoo. Where in the world is he? But I had been listening to it for so long, it sounded clean. It's why we talk about picking healthy comparisons. Because over time, doing wrong feels normal to me, but not God. And we say God has given us these structures, parents, friendships, and relationships as illustrations of, he's like, I'm not going to come and show up at your doorstep again, but I did give you a mama and a daddy and a structure that says, I am your father in, and so sometimes mama and daddy are just a reflection. Mama and daddy ain't never going to be perfect, but sometimes they're a reflection of how far we have strayed when doing wrong seems like it just became normal. And so with that, God willing, one of the reasons why God is giving us these stories, right? These Hoseas, these Ezekiels, these Jeremiahs, these Isaiahs, is to help us understand the way back. So God willing, when you put the sermon down, you're like, you're talking to them through half of lunch now. I'm hungry. Hangry, as folks say sometimes, right? But God willing, even if you don't go back to the sermon, when you're studying the Word, you're creating your own checklist of fundamentals that can help me either measure, am I really in a place that's pleasing God? Or am I in a place where I'm saying, I know, when God's saying, you really? It's helping me find my way back in situations where I might think I'm doing just fine. Forgot the last illustration, so it's time to shut up. With that, God willing, as we go out into this week and go out into the holiday season, may we, I forgot just that quick. That's what's happening in my memory now. I was trying to wrap it back up and keep talking. I told somebody today, one of the telltale signs of healthy preparation, they're like, oh, if you prepared more, it's going to be a longer sermon, right? I was like, no, it's actually the opposite. The more you prepare, the more you can keep it wrapped in and dialed in. Because the less opportunity you give yourself to take tangents and forget the conclusion. So with that, I apologize. Have a happy holiday season, and hopefully something in here would be like Proverbs. You don't see a whole lot of nice, tidy conclusions to the Proverbs. God willing, you will find something in the sermon that will bless you through this holiday season as we together stand and sing.
I heard the voice of